Inside the marble chambers of the United Nations headquarters, world leaders gathered once again under the weight of history. It was September 23rd, 2025, a day charged with urgency and a moment when the war in Ukraine continued to dominate the global agenda. This was not just another Security Council meeting. This was an appeal that carried with it a sharp accusation and a direct call to one of the most powerful nations on earth, China. Taking the floor, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered his remarks with a calm but cutting tone. He looked at the assembled delegates, then fixed his words on Beijing. China is also represented here, a powerful nation on which Russia now depends completely. If China truly wanted this war to stop, it could compel Moscow to end the invasion. Without China, Putin's Russia is nothing. Yet too often, China stays silent and distant instead of acting for peace. It was one of the most direct challenges Zelensky had ever issued, and it echoed across the chamber like a warning shot. This was more than a plea, it was an indictment. For Zelensky, the message was clear. Russia's ability to sustain its war effort was not built only on its own resilience or even the Kremlin's strategy. It was, in many ways, dependent on the choices of others, and none more than China. For more than 3 years, Ukraine had fought with Western support. The United States and the European Union had provided weapons, intelligence, and billions in financial aid. Yet while Western nations sought to choke Russia through sanctions, another great power had stepped in to soften the blow. Beijing, officially claiming neutrality, became a vital lifeline. Chinese purchases of discounted Russian oil and gas provided Moscow with steady revenue. Chinese technology, sometimes civilian, often dual use, helped keep Russian industries functioning. And Chinese diplomacy shielded Moscow from total isolation on the world stage. Zelensky's words reflected a reality many analysts had warned about. Without Chinese trade, without Chinese markets, without Chinese political cover, Russia would be far weaker. Without China, Putin's Russia is nothing, Zelensky declared. It was an extraordinary statement, not just for its bluntness, but for what it revealed about Ukraine's shifting strategy. Kyiv was no longer just appealing to Washington, London, or Brussels. It was now appealing directly to Beijing, hoping to highlight its responsibility. The stakes could not be higher. The war has left cities in ruins, turned millions into refugees, and cost tens of thousands of lives. Ukraine has reclaimed large areas of its territory, but at staggering cost. Russia, despite losses, remains entrenched in the east and south, relying on its military machine and its international backers. China's role in this balance has been difficult to ignore. Beijing insists it is a neutral player. Chinese officials frequently call for peace negotiations, rejecting sanctions and denouncing what they describe as Western double standards. They present themselves as advocates of stability. Yet the economic data tells another story. Trade between China and Russia has soared, surpassing $200 billion last year, setting new records. Chinese companies supply everything from cars to electronics, while Russian oil tankers continue to unload at Chinese ports. Energy that once fueled Europe now fuels China's factories. This relationship, described by many as lifeline diplomacy, has allowed Moscow to withstand sanctions that might otherwise have crippled its economy. China, in turn, secures energy at discounted rates, strengthens its global reach, and reinforces a partnership that counters Western influence. It is, as many analysts describe, a marriage of convenience, pragmatic, strategic, and deeply consequential for Ukraine. That is why Zelensky's words hit with such force. He was not only appealing for solidarity, he was naming what he saw as the enabler of Russian aggression. The silence of Beijing, he argued, was not neutrality, it was complicity. The backdrop for this speech is critical. Since the beginning of the war, Beijing has positioned itself carefully, never sending weapons directly, but never condemning Moscow either. Chinese diplomats argue that NATO expansion and Western provocation pushed Russia to act. They say that Washington fuels the conflict by pouring in weapons. But in Kyiv's view, these arguments are excuses. Every barrel of oil sold to China, every shipment of technology delivered to Russia translates into more bombs, more artillery, more destruction on Ukrainian soil. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look beyond the battlefield. The war in Ukraine has become more than a clash between Kyiv and Moscow. It is a testing ground for the global order. On one side, the West attempts to maintain its system of alliances and rules. On the other, powers like Russia and China see an opportunity to reshape that system, to push back against what they call Western dominance. For Ukraine, this means survival depends not only on its soldiers, but on how the great powers play their cards. Zelensky's appeal was strategic. By highlighting China's power over Russia, he hoped to introduce moral pressure on Beijing. If China truly desires global respect, if it truly wants to present itself as a leader of peace and development, then it cannot sit idly by while war rages in Europe. If it wishes to be a global statesman, he implied, then it must act like one. But Beijing has little incentive to do so. For China, Russia is more than a partner. It is a buffer against the West. It provides raw materials, energy, and a geopolitical ally against Washington. For President Xi Jinping, standing firmly against Putin risks weakening that partnership, while siding openly with Ukraine would strengthen the West's hand. So, for now, silence remains the policy. This silence has global implications. Across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, nations watch how China navigates the crisis. Many are unwilling to take sides. They see Beijing's neutrality not as cowardice, but as a mirror of their own hesitance. For Ukraine, however, neutrality feels like abandonment. The war has now dragged into its fourth year. Entire regions of Ukraine remain under occupation. Cities once bustling with life are shells of rubble. Families remain separated. The toll is staggering. And yet, despite Western weapons and Ukrainian resilience, the war shows no signs of ending. That is why Zelensky insists the power to stop it lies not just in Kyiv or Washington, but in Beijing. Analysts say this was one of the most significant moments of the UN session. By calling out China directly, Zelensky reframed the conflict as not only Europe's tragedy, but as a global test of responsibility. Could China, with all its power and influence, choose to end the war by tightening the screws on Moscow, or would it continue to stand by quietly, shielding Russia through trade and diplomacy? The answer remains uncertain. What is clear is that China has become indispensable to Russia's survival. The phrase, "without China, Putin's Russia is nothing," will likely be remembered as a turning point in Ukraine's rhetoric. It was not aimed at the Kremlin. It was aimed at Beijing, at the Chinese people, at the world. It was a call to act. As the Security Council session ended, diplomats filed out, the cameras switched off, and the debates moved into private rooms. But the question Zelensky raised lingers. Will China continue to shield Russia, or will it one day decide that peace is in its interest? For Ukraine, the stakes are existential. For Russia, the stakes are survival. For China, the stakes are about global power and the image it wishes to project in the 21st century. And for the world, the stakes are nothing less than the shape of international order for decades to come. This war, as Zelensky reminded the Council, is not just Ukraine's struggle. It is a mirror held up to the world, forcing every nation to decide, in the face of aggression, will they remain silent or will they act?
China is also represented here, a powerful nation on which Russia now depends completely. If China truly wanted this war to stop, it could compel Moscow to end the invasion. Without China, Putin's Russia is nothing. Yet too often, China stays silent and distant instead of active for peace.